Why, hello there. In my previous video where I explored the Spanish inspiration seen in the Blasphemous 2 trailer, I said that I would be back with a more detailed analysis of the trailer, and here it is. If you haven't watched the previous video, I encourage you to watch it after this one, as I point out some really cool Andalusian-inspired details that I will only cover generally here. In every other sense though, in this video I cover every little detail about the gameplay and story that I could find by picking it apart frame by frame. In addition, I also include footage shown in the Nintendo Indie Showcase that is either new or extended in that video. And finally, I will also cover any notable news since the announcement and any other sneak peeks of Blasphemous 2 shown off on the official Twitter account and on the Blasphemous 2 website. Let's get into it. First off, let's talk a little bit of news. On the Team 17 Blasphemous 1 playthrough stream, Blasphemous publisher Team 17 confirmed that PS4 and Xbox One compatible versions are being worked on. I know I saw a few people bummed that PS4 wasn't listed for Blasphemous 2, but rest assured that the Game Kitchen is working on it. To clarify the reason, I don't believe this has anything to do with PS4 and Xbox One being able to run it on those systems, but more a matter of limited time. They understandably prioritized getting the game to run well on the current gen systems, and are now going through the optimization and certification process for those systems as far as I can tell. This does also sort of hint to me that they are determined to hit the release window of late summer 2023, as I'm sure that optimally they would have announced when they could announce for all platforms. But as it stands, I wouldn't worry about Blasphemous 2 not coming to PS4 and Xbox One. The other bit of news is that, at least at the moment, a physical release at launch for Blasphemous 2 is not guaranteed, and there is no information currently about a collector's edition. Blasphemous 1 was in the same boat if I recall correctly, and it ended up having a bunch of wonderful physical and collector's editions. And I just want to add that there has been a rumored and seemingly kind of legitimate evidence that the trophy list for Blasphemous 2 has leaked. I will not be looking at that at all, and I won't be referring to anything that is contained in there, even if it's the official names of the weapons, so please don't comment with any of that information because it's something I'm not interested in looking at, and I'm not going to cover that as part of my Blasphemous 2 news and coverage. As a general rule, I won't be covering anything that leaks. I'm going to stick with official information in every case. That is the news covered for now, which brings us up to pulling apart all of the current footage and images pixel by pixel. So the way that I've chosen to organize this analysis is by grouping footage and images by a common connection, which is generally the area that the footage appears to be in. So it won't go in the order of the trailer exactly, but this approach will hopefully allow us to develop a more holistic understanding of some of these areas. In this first scene, there are a number of people or statues of people surrounding the resting place of the Penitent One. In Wounds of Eventide, we saw him laid to rest after defeating the High Wills and releasing the Twisted Father. We see this sarcophagus now, held by Deo Gracias, or a statue depicting him, in the kneeling pose we often saw him in during Blasphemous 1, but instead of a scroll, he is holding the sarcophagus of the Penitent One. Are these statues or petrified people? I'm going to say that they're probably petrified people, because Blasphemous 1 has no shortage of petrified people in the game. This would mean then that Deo Gracias may have petrified holding the Penitente's sarcophagus, which means that dude was shredded. We then see the Penitent One's hand grasp the side of the sarcophagus, his right hand now wooden in appearance. This reflects ending A in Blasphemous 1, where the Penitent One, after sitting on the turned throne and killing himself, turns to wood, his right arm a gnarled twist of roots. This is consistent with other important figures touched by the miracle, such as the Twisted One, who is fused with his log, and Escribar, who was transformed into a great tree by the miracle. Before diving into the content of the gameplay, I wanted to briefly mention for those unaware that one of the major changes from Blasphemous 1 to the sequel In Blasphemous 2, 3 distinct weapons have replaced the mea culpa, which of course crumbled after the Twisted Father was freed in the true ending of Blasphemous 1. I mentioned the new weapons in my quick overview of the trailer, but the new weapons are the Praying Blade, the War Censer, and the Rapier and Dagger. I will cover the weapons in more detail as they appear and show off what they can do, but I wanted to address it up front because this is a major change to the basic gameplay. Here we see Penitente running along the ruined remains of what appears to be a bridge. We see an aquatic variation of the Dirt Diver from Blasphemous 1, instead of the monstrous, zombie-like upper half with a fleshy, potentially root-like tail. We have these web-fingered, fishy-looking people with their lower half having been removed / mutilated into a tail, their spinal cord exposed. They're leaping out of the water into a backflip, trying to grab the Penitente in the process. Penitente strikes the Dude with the rapier mid-air, landing on the next section of bridge and performing a lunging attack against a pair of headless pikemen. You can see what appears to be seaweed hanging off their shoulders and their weapons, which I think might be a spontoon or a half-pike. So we are getting an aquatic through line from the enemies in this area. This makes sense with the Cadiz Cathedral-inspired building in the background, because Cadiz is a port city on a narrow peninsula. You may have noticed the damage numbers appeared, signifying damage dealt by the Rapier and Dagger as Penitente attacked the Dude and the Headless Soldiers. I know that this is a bit of a contested addition by fans, but I think that with 3 weapons featuring different abilities necessitates the option for players to be able to compare the damage output. I'm personally all for showing damage numbers, as it was information I wish I could have had more available in Blasphemous 1, but I think that an ideal situation would be if the damage numbers could be toggled on and off in the settings. And lastly, in this scene, I want to point out the little street lamp mounted to the wall. This is a small detail, but it sets us up for what look to be some more modern touches in Blasphemous 2 compared to Blasphemous 1, and by that I mean a move to maybe the 1700s. In the next scene we have this large ghoulish person with a skeletal face stuck through some kind of wooden board, getting slammed down in what looks like an execution style move by Penitente. The enemy in the surrounding gives the impression of being near the sea. Seaweed is strewn across the landscape and is hanging from the enemy. We can also see barnacles on the board that their head is stuck through. And we get to see a bit more footage of this enemy through a Twitter post by the official Blasphemous account. The surrounding is now an interior, but seaweed is still seen hanging from the vaulted ceiling and adorning the windows. You can also see a black substance, perhaps ink, on the floor. Combine ink with a nautical theme, and I don't think it's too outlandish to suggest that we might be doing battle with some cephalopods in Blasphemous 2. The thrust of this tweet was to show off that Blasphemous 2 will be just as gory as the first game, showing the full execution move here, where the trailer cut away from Penitente popping the crap out of this dude. On the topic of content, I wanted to take just a moment to further reassure people that Blasphemous 2 is very likely not sanitizing itself. This was a complaint that came from the first trailer, where some fans felt that compared to the trailers for Blasphemous 1, this one was a bit more sanitized, and fans were worried that this might be some sort of limit on the gore and the violence in Blasphemous 2. First off, the game is not officially rated yet at the time of this video releasing in early May, so we can't judge on that level how graphic the content will be. However, on SteamDB you can see that the game has adult violence and sexual content, and that nudity, frequent violence, or gore and generally mature content are all assigned to the game. So do not worry about the devs limiting their creativity for the sake of the rating. They seem to be very much unimpeded in that regard. And obviously it is a concern about being limited more than demanding Blasphemous has a certain amount of guts and genitals on the screen, but to my mind the sample of bosses and NPCs shown in this trailer is more than enough evidence to me that they are really going for it with the bizarre and surreal designs. Here we have the return of the altar server, who is in a slightly new getup from the first game, but still very much wanting to impale Penitente with their candelabra. Penitente wielding the praying blade jumps over the attack. In the background we can see reference the Plaza de España, but we also see what looks like prayer beads strung up as well as holding up a platform. In this next scene, I believe what we are seeing here is one of the special moves of the praying blade. Penitente first does a special animation where, with his surroundings dimmed, he slashes the praying blade through the air, generating bursts of some kind of red energy around him. He then proceeds to attack a new enemy, some kind of winged creature, with a flurry of slashes, the damage numbers popping up twice for every slash made. In the background we see giant prayer beads wrapping around the columns and strung from the archways, linking the area shown previously. And what I believe to be the first boss fight shown in this video, this scene shows another penitent facing off and charging towards Penitente. As mentioned in my previous video, this was a cut boss from Blasphemous 1, and I am happy to see him get new life in the sequel. It's a fun design with the severed head storage in the tummy featuring a little view window. And of course there are strung up rosary beads indicating this may have a connection to the other two areas previously shown. In this scene we see Penitente navigating what appears to be a dining hall of some kind, and I would suggest that is the dining hall of a manor or palace for reasons that I will explain. On the far left we see a person wearing a ruff crouching down. In the Nintendo Indie World Showcase the footage shows a bit more, and we can see this little dude chasing Penitente by flipping around. We can also see another enemy of this type hanging from the ceiling on the far end, as you can make out the ruff and cape as he begins to strike at the very end of this scene. The ruff reminds me of the Headless Chamberlain from Blasphemous 1. I don't think these enemies are related mechanically, considering the obvious difference, but they are similar in that the ruff suggests they are part of the aristocracy, and I think this enemy, like the Headless Chamberlain, may be part of the royal court. Next, we see an enemy that is referencing a famous portrait of Eugenia Martinez Vallejo. I cover her story in my previous video, linked below and in the card in the top right, but the important information here is that Eugenia served as an entertainer for the court of Charles II due to her large size believed to be caused by a genetic disorder. In my previous video, my modern sensibilities obviously condemned the use of someone as entertainment for being different, but this comment brought up a point I feel is relevant about this practice. Historically, people with deformities were sometimes believed to be the result of divine intervention. These people were summoned to the court for entertainment, but also because they may be touched by the divine. While certainly abhorrent to our standards, being touched by the divine is obviously a major theme in the Blasphemous series, and so referencing Eugenia is not only cultural but thematically relevant to the game. And similar to the historical Eugenia, I think that this enemy is also meant to represent an entertainer of the royal court. And apparently this lady entertains by throwing chandeliers like a top. So for the enemies in this scene, we have an aristocratic type enemy that may be a royal attendant, and an enemy type that is implied to be an entertainer of the royal court. This all leads me to believe that the area is a manor or palace, and we are seeing the dining hall of this place, which has some dark implications. There are webs everywhere in this place, with people entwined in web on the floor as well as hanging from the ceiling. This makes me wonder if the miracle may have manifested some arachnid qualities in the royal court, who now prey on their subjects in a more literal way. Next, we see Penitente in a foggy forest being attacked by a ghostly figure wielding a sword. This enemy appears to be similar to the merdudes we saw in a previous scene, this time with an armored skeletal warrior wearing a pointy ethereal hat up top and nothing but a severed midsection and cape remaining on the lower half. These similarities lead me to think that this enemy has leapt out of the ground or appears overhead, and we are catching its downward plunge toward Penitente, who blocks the explosive shockwave created by the enemy upon jamming their sword into the ground. There is also a skull behind Penitente on a root-enshrined pedestal with a glowing blue aura surrounding it that matches the hue of the enemy. This makes me wonder if perhaps the enemy is guarding that, or the skull needs to be destroyed in order to neutralize the enemy. In the final frames of this scene, you can see that this enemy starts to dissipate, potentially waiting for the Penitente to come back through to reappear and make another attack. This next scene is short, but it's a good time to bring up a new mechanic that we saw previously in the Manor scene, the air dash. Bringing in a more traditional Metroidvania mainstay, we see the Penitente use the air dash to zip through a glowing blue set of chains with his dagger in order to pass through to the other side and grab a wall climb. With the dagger pointed out, it makes me wonder if this will also be usable as an attack. I personally enjoy as much utility out of Metroidvania style abilities as possible, with ones that serve a function to access new areas, give more traversal options, and expand combat capabilities being the perfect sweet spot. The relics in Blasphemous 1 were largely traversal keys that could only be used in specific situations. While I appreciated these relics and enjoyed the progression of access these offered, I'm happy to see the air dash as an element that can be used more universally during play. As for the context of this scene, this very vertical area seems to be covered in wax, with it dripping down the wall climb portions of the wall and piling up on the floor above. This is coming from an abundance of candles in this area, as we will notice in the upcoming scene. There is also a curious detail here in the form of an opening in the wall, which seems like it could house an enemy or potentially some sort of environmental challenge. Continuing our journey in Candleland, I would guess this area is further down than in the last scene, and we can see the massive number of melted candles in the background. We could also see another detail that I couldn't quite make out in the previous scene, but is also present, which is that this place is upside down. In the background, you can see how the Gothic pointed arches are facing downward, as well as the windows. And you can see in the background and the foreground how the capitals of the columns are at the base of the column instead of at the top, and that the Ionic capitals seen here are upside down relative to how we normally see this design. Looking back at the previous scene, you can see the arches at the top of the screen are in fact upside down as well. This obviously brings to mind the inverted castle from Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and makes me wonder if this might be something that gets activated or if it's just a natural state of this building. In favor of the building just being inverted is that the orientation of the candles and how they're dripping is in accordance with gravity being down, meaning that these candles were lit and burned after the building itself became inverted, and seemingly has been for a long time. That doesn't mean that we might not turn the building right side up, however. This phenomenon may also explain these magical chains, which could be acting as a means to keep the building together in either orientation for magic reasons. Besides the inverted nature of this space, in the indie showcase footage we also saw what appears to be a large, armless, grumpy cardinal sliding across the floor. We also see a waxen candle person crawling across the ground that the Penitente leaps over. And at the beginning of the scene, we are given a glimpse of one of the glass enshrined chains from Blasphemous 1 returning to open up shortcuts for us. Penitente, praying blade in hand, is jumping between rings held by what appear to be children of moonlight from Blasphemous 1. In my video about the Spanish and Andalusian inspirations of Blasphemous 1, I discuss how the Children of Moonlight appear to be opposed to the state of Custodia in the game, assisting Penitente in accomplishing his goals. It is the Children of Moonlight who return Penitente to the last prie-dieu after dying in Blasphemous 1, and it seems like they may be continuing their assistance in the sequel in new ways. This is similar to the appearance of new platforms using the blood perpetuated in sand in Blasphemous 1, where we can see more Children of Moonlight holding rings appearing as Penitente grapples his way up. In fact, this appears like it could be the sequel's version of that relic, and that it is being used either as a shortcut or access to a new portion of the area in this scene. You can see that there is an alternative way up using wall climbs and air dashes in a way similar to the previous scene, but that the Penitente is instead traversing vertically using these rings and going up to the right of the column instead of the left. In the indie showcase footage, you can see the environmental dangers in the form of dripping wax falling from above. In this still image from the Blasphemous 2 website, We get another peek of Candleland, and this time Penitente is fighting what appears to be a variant of the altar server we've seen previously, which seems fitting. In this next scene, we can see Penitente use the war sensor to ring a bell that will activate what look to be quicksilver platforms as this aura spreads out from the bell. This functions as a bit of timed platforming up to this statue or object holding a mirror that we will see more about in the next scene, and is used to transport and direct Penitente, in this case presumably through the grating. As mentioned, the war sensor is used to ring this bell, and I wonder if the other weapons can also be used to activate it, or if we will need to use certain weapons to perform particular functions out in the world. If the latter is the case, it makes me wonder if there will be a dedicated button to swap weapons for ease of use. I do like the idea of weapons being used to perform particular non-combat functions, as this increases the design space and functionality of these weapons that could provide interesting ways to test the player. We also get our first look at the Prie-Dieu in Blasphemous 2, which has a very similar but distinct design from its counterpart in the first game. As mentioned, this scene shows us the functionality of these mirror statue things as a traversal challenge, requiring Penitente to perform an air dash at the correct time to use the next mirror to avoid the thorns below. Spikes are back, baby, and only time will tell if they're still a mortal threat. And continuing the conversation about the potential non-combat functionality of the three weapons, notice how you can see electricity coming off of Penitente in the animation where he is transported through the mirror. In the Nintendo Indie Showcase, the narration over the Blasphemous 2 footage says that you can wield the war sensor for slow but powerful flaming strikes, the rapier and dagger to attack with lightning-fast precision, and the praying blade for vicious and versatile combos. The phrase lightning fast normally does not suggest something is electrical in nature, however with the sensor having flaming strikes, I will throw out the possibility that lightning fast in this instance could have a bit of a double meaning, and that skills learned for the rapier and dagger involve special lightning attacks. And I'll also throw out the possibility that perhaps the rapier and dagger is required to traverse through these mirrors. Even more speculatively, I noticed that the air dash, the move Penitente uses to use the mirrors, is only shown in the trailer when the rapier and dagger is equipped. This very well could simply be the case of this being such a limited slice of gameplay that the air dash can be done wielding any of the weapons, but for now I think it is at least worth noting and keeping an eye on that there is a small possibility the air dash is a special move for the rapier and dagger. As a broader note about special moves for the trinity of weapons shown off, the showcase labels these new moves as weapon memories, and that they will be unlocked over the course of the game. Lastly about this scene, in the Indie Showcase we get extended footage, which shows at the end of this pit of thorns a wall that we will later see can be broken by a plunging attack. This is another short scene showing off traversal in Blasphemous 2, a common theme in this trailer. In this scene, Penitente is wall climbing, this time on these portions of walls that are not waxy, but instead rusty or bloody, and the scene appears to be outside. We also see a new enemy, a flying jar who appears to have wings made out of the contents of the jar, which are also spilling out of the top. In a scene shown in the Indie Showcase, we see a bit more of this area, and it features the return of the Wandering Tomb enemy from Blasphemous 1. We see Penitente make short work of him using a 3-shot combo from the Praying Blade. Unsurprisingly, but worth noting, is that the damage dealt by the Praying Blade goes up by 7 with each hit, indicating that the sequel will reward combos the same as Blasphemous 1. Here we find Penitente fighting a dual sickle wielding enemy in white and gold robes inside what looks like a house. You can also see particles floating in through the door to the far right, which could indicate a snowy area outside. The most interesting thing to me about this scene though is that it appears Penitente is blocking multiple attacks with the rapier and dagger. In Blasphemous 1 you could parry or deflect attacks by pressing the parry button at the right time, but you could not hold the parry button to block multiple attacks. Here we see Penitente block 3 attacks with no animation indicating that the parry button was pressed to deflect every swing. We see something similar in a previous scene with the Praying Blade, where Penitente deflects the shockwave and we see the Praying Blade deflect multiple hits from the shockwave with one block. This could also be a new way of visually showing the deflect. Also, perhaps defending against the first attack in a chain deflects the whole chain, but that seems unlikely to me. It appears to me that maybe you're now able to hold down block. However, in a game I'm assuming still doesn't have stamina, I wonder what the trade-off would be so that players couldn't just hold down the parry button and block endlessly. Perhaps holding parry depletes fervor while it is held, I'm really not sure. And it's very possible that I'm misreading this, and it is simply a visual change from Blasphemous 1 where deflecting an attack only popped the deflect animation once. Either way, it is something to keep an eye on. The Flagellant is reprising his role in Blasphemous 2, this time wielding a two-handed whip. Penitente performs a plunging attack on him using the Praying Blade, and I want to emphasize the animation here and keep it in mind for an upcoming scene. We also see at the top left the visual indicator for the Children of Moonlight handholds that we saw previously. This scene features these massive stone columns in the background that seem like they could belong to a bridge. We can see roots growing out of and entangling the columns. At ground level there appears to be sand, indicating that this area could be near the ocean, or it's some more ash. You can never count out more ash. In part 2 of our plunge attack series, we see Penitente in the process of performing a plunging attack with the Praying Blade again. This animation is different from the previous plunging attack animation, with the red energy in the windup, the blade swirling with energy on the way down, and a more explosive impact upon landing, which is used to break an obstacle. It seems to me that this is an upgraded version of the plunging attack. We also see the plunging attack performed in both instances while wielding the Praying Blade, suggesting to me that plunge attacks are possibly a special move for the Praying Blade. We can also see one of the mirrored platforms dissipating as Penitente descends, indicating that they got into this position by ringing another one of those bells we saw previously to generate the platforms. We've also seen the mirrors that we've seen transport Penitente by performing a well-timed air dash. This is very speculative, but on the off chance the air dash is performed by the rapier, the bell is rung by the war sensor, and the Praying Blade performs plunging attacks, then this traversal challenge would require you to have active the rapier to air dash, then switch to the war sensor to activate platforms, and then switch to the Praying Blade as you reach the top in order to perform the plunging attack in order to break the obstacle. A test not only of platforming, but solving the puzzle of this challenge, and then being able to swap weapons for their particular use does sound like an intriguing sequence of gameplay and a large design space for the game kitchen to play in. Of course, this is all speculation right now, and it is still very possible these actions are not weapon dependent, but it is fun to consider. Before moving on, I do want to mention that in my previous video about Spanish inspirations, I did suggest the background skyline could be Granada, but I was politely corrected that the footage I used was of the Toledo skyline. As stated in the video, I do think that this background could be inspired by a few Andalusian cities, but I wanted to acknowledge that correction. Thank you, Lorenzo Andrioli 9422. In this scene, we see Penitente getting rough in the streets with a couple of flying corpses in coffins. The Penitente is wielding the war sensor and performs a spinning special attack where he jumps up between the enemies and smacks them for some heavy damage. As stated in the showcase, you can see the flaming strikes of the sensor burning the enemies. This attack appears to have dissipated the double-headed spears that these enemies have borrowed from the Tres Angustias in Blasphemous 1. In this sense, they seem similar to the Wraiths in the first game, where their casting time would reset if hit before launching their projectile. This area appears to be a city street along the ocean or river, with what seems to be Baroque-style residential buildings in the background, and a waterside pathway and lamplights in the foreground. The showcase also showed a new enemy in the form of a statue wielding a sword and protected by a floating stone. Penitente activates a buff or special move for the Praying Blade that we've seen previously, and first destroys the floating shield and then turns the sword-wielding statue to dust. Here we see Penitente in front of a fountain clearly inspired by the Court of the Lions fountain at the Alhambra. Penitente is hovering in the air, some kind of energy lifting him up. The background then disappears, and a pale blue energy the same color as the parry animation shoots beams out of Penitente and then cuts to black. This reads to me like it could be some kind of upgrade animation, but I'm not entirely sure. There was also a still that seems to be from the same area posted on the Blasphemous 2 website. Here we can see similar Alhambra-inspired Moorish architecture. We can also see Penitente wielding a flaming war censer, about to strike what looks to be a variant of the flagellant previously seen. And now in this next section I'm going to show the various scenes that show bosses and NPCs. Here we see the Penitente fighting what appears to be a boss. They are an armored warrior with cloth covering their face, wielding what seems to be a breaking wheel. We see them spin the wheel and use it to hang in the air before throwing it down at Penitente, which lodges into the ground after Penitente slides out of the way. The background in this image is a bit reminiscent of the resting place of Penitente, with petrified people reaching out toward, in this case, the statue of a large lady with the face broken off. In this next section, we see this giant skeletal clergyman wielding a scythe adorned with skeletons, which he uses to slam down on Penitente, who uses the praying blade to deflect the attack. We see both the rapier and praying blade deflect, which is not at all unexpected as it is a core mechanic in Blasphemous 1, but it is confirmed here to be a function of both weapons in this trailer. This boss is also wearing a skeleton on his back encased in glass, and it appears the shards of the broken glass sarcophagus have embedded in his skull, forming a crown of spikes on his head. This area is covered in what could be sand but is likely ash, with other skeletons propped up on boards littering the ash heap in the background. In this scene, Penitente is being absolutely no help to this large lady holding up the remains of a broken archway and a pair of composite columns. We can see the particles similar to those shown in this scene floating in from outside, and we can just barely make out the beginnings of something crumbling or dripping off of the ruined archway. In this scene, we see Penitente hanging out with what appears to be an NPC, bringing new meaning to putting on a good face. He is wearing very ornate vestments that are notable for their abundance of faces. In this very surreal space surrounding them, the walls are made up of or covered in what appears to be fabric that contains even more faces, and Penitente is standing on a floor covered in these chasubles or whatever garb or rug it might be. Next, we have what appears to be another NPC, a large lady bursting from the ground, surrounded by children of moonlight and a collection of large chalices. Javier Prado, referenced in my previous video, suggests that she may be an enchanted Mora, a supernatural being who appears as a large woman with long hair that she combs. Enchanted Mora can sometimes be found with gold or golden objects, and the chalices around her certainly fit that description. Here we see an arm protruding from a stack of goods that I think could be this game's version of Candelaria, the moving vendor from Blasphemous 1. This is a really fun design and sort of takes the surreal experience of finding this traveling vendor around the world in unlikely places and notches it up. Next, we see an NPC that I imagine is a reference to the Pieta by Michelangelo, plus some extra arms. We can also see flowers falling to the ground in the foreground, and a series of statues praying in little chapels facing away from the people. I like this design quite a bit. The dawning realization of the extra arms is very creepy and evocative. In this adorable scene, some little dudes pray to and kiss this large, disembodied hand. I'm going to mark this as an NPC, as much as a giant floating hand can be one. I love this design and has already been and will continue to be showcased. They really went hard on these surreal and bizarre concepts in a way that really compels you to understand what the f is going on. Here we see a very animated character that looks to be another boss. I covered this in more detail in my previous video, but the design is that of an affilador or knife sharpener, which is a profession that still exists in small numbers today, where the affilador rides around playing a pan flute to let anyone who needs their knives sharpened know that they're around. And this guy has no shortage of sharpening to do here, as the place from head to toe is littered with weapons for sharpening. I love the design of this scene. It looks like a painting. We see Penitente before one of the few semi-regular sized NPCs we've seen, an angelic looking lady with a halo of Children of Moonlight surrounding her, all the while standing atop a giant hand, very similar in design to the other hand we saw previously. She is holding a large scroll and facing it outward toward Penitente, indicating to me that she is showing Penitente something. In the background is a structure inspired by the Aqueduct of the Miracle in Merida, Spain. The structure appears to be distinct from that in the background where Penitente performs a plunging attack. Although they both appear to have sand at their base, the design of the columns is different and there are no surrounding trees in this scene. This next scene shows Penitente standing before a large man emerging from a pool of what could be gold or honey that is flowing out of him through holes in his hands, face, and back. This is inspired by an event in Seville where, through random circumstance, a statue depicting Jesus crucified began to leak honey out of its eyes after bees set up a nest inside, and I talk about that in more detail in my previous video. And as you can see, bees are flying around this NPC in this shot. In this scene from the Indie Showcase, Penitente is facing off against an enemy covered in yellow cloth and wielding a curved blade that he throws into the air. The big detail in this scene though is that we see Penitente switch from the rapier and dagger to the war censer in mid-air. This confirms not only that you will be able to wield multiple weapons at once, but that the switch can occur while moving. This is the strongest evidence to me that certain weapons may perform specific non-combat functions, such as a plunging attack to break a barrier, or the rapier and dagger to air dash, as they would need to be available at all times and be able to switch weapons quickly while moving. In this GIF posted by the Blasphemous Twitter account, we see Penitente fighting an enemy who might ring a bell, the charging Nell from the first game. Now Penitente can perform an execution on this guy, and we see him use his wooden arm to sprout thorns and pop him like a tomato. Brutal. Hello, Sean here. After recording the audio for this video, the Twitter official Blasphemous account released 2 new segments of gameplay that I want to discuss in this video, so I'm adding it on here, which is why I may have said a couple things in the previous video that are now confirmed, or stuff that I just didn't know about at the time of recording it. So let's get into these scenes. In this first scene here, we see the Penitent One wreck a couple of statues with the rapier and dagger. Note here how, unlike the praying blade, which is in the Nintendo Direct stated as having devastating combos, that the rapier is described as being lightning fast. So we see the rapier doing flat damage here until Penitente either performs a special move or there is a critical attack in which he does this special move that does extra damage and is in red. I also want to point out that it is after this point at which we see the Penitente's rapier start to have an electrical effect on it, which confirms something I was guessing at when I wrote the original script, which is that the rapier and dagger will have some sort of electricity relating to its special effects. I'm curious here if the reason it gets this electrical buff on it is that it is a special move, or that a property of the rapier is potentially that consecutive hits will generate this electrical effect on it that gives it a damage buff. In this scene, we have a return from the Holy Line in Blasphemous 1, this wheelie dude, and the Penitente is going ham on him with the war censer, in which he uses a special move that sends a gout of flame at him and just absolutely wrecks him. It's also very cool, the animation where you can see the air actually sort of warbling around Penitente as he does this attack. Very cool. And there you have it, we squeezed every juicy pixel out of the Blasphemous 2 reveal trailer and associated images and footage. What it all adds up to for me is a very exciting sequel to the first Blasphemous. It has the art direction and surreal designs that I love, and it looks like they're really kicking it up a notch when it comes to gameplay, both in combat encounters as well as traversal challenges. The multiple weapons seem very promising and versatile, which is exactly what I want from tools in a Metroidvania title. If you enjoyed this thorough dive, please like this video and share it with other Blasphemous fans. If you want more Blasphemous content, please subscribe to the channel as I continue to cover the news and information about the game before release, and then cover the game from design to story after it releases. Thanks for watching.